Hi, welcome to Not in Your Head Lesbian. Today's show is very different. There are so many deep dives that need to be done that don't happen because people are very busy. So, for example, I came across an article by Abigail Shrier, which is very important. It's called A Predator's Paradise. Now, it's a very long article, and I have gained great insight, and I want to share it by reading the entire article. A Predator's Paradise by Abigail Shrier. On the grounds of making California more welcoming to LGBTQ youth, State Senator Scott Wiener is transforming the state into a haven for human trafficking. On a Saturday night, South Los Angeles, cars pull up and idle along side streets of Figueroa. High beams ablaze so that the drivers can get a good look at the girls. The women stand three astride in the middle of the street, in pasties and G-string bikinis, under fishnet dresses. Draped over their shoulders are unzipped coats. Even in temperate LA, the night's January chill is biting. In 7-inch lucite heels, they teeter towards the driver of each car the way you might walk across gravel barefoot. Less than a block away, the pimps keep company on a sidewalk corner in hoodies and loose jeans, watching their quarry, awaiting the payout. Absent is the one thing that might typically break up this party: a police car. In early January, I, Abigail Shrier, joined Aaron Wilson and Stephanie Powell on a tour of the track on Figueroa, one of California's busiest prostitution areas. For decades, Wilson, who volunteers for the anti-trafficking organization Journey Out, and her mother, Powell, have worked to combat trafficking in Los Angeles and to help women and child victims escape this brutal world. In our post-feminist era, prostitution is often idealized. Sex work is work. It is easy to overlook the gruesome reality of what it means to have a pimp, an arrangement closer to slavery than any legitimate job. The horror stories I could tell you about prostitutes being beaten and being choked and being burnt and being gang raped, said Vanessa Russell of Love Never Fails, an anti-trafficking nonprofit based near Oakland. And the PTSD and all the mental health, the trauma bonding, the psychotic breaks. Maybe you're somebody who likes to have sex more than once a day, but 9 to 21 times with different guys, some that are like 90 years old and smell? 9 to 21 times over what period, I ask. One day, she said. That's healthy living? I don't think so. The body is not even made for that. Like the pelvic inflammatory disease that you see. She ticks off the ways a woman's body is subjected to microbial assault, the STDs, the yeast infections, the UTIs that are frequent among the women she sees. The hospital records prove, she says, that the human body is not meant to have that much activity going on. And then the girls that are out there, where they're being sold, they don't even get to take showers in between. While the last few decades have seen an increase in human trafficking, women at all three of the anti-trafficking groups I spoke with across California agreed nothing compares with the stunning rise in trafficking they've witnessed in recent months. Powell, formerly a sergeant in LAPD's Vice Department Division, knows the streets intimately. Over the last 6 months, the number of prostitutes has doubled, she says. On Figaro, between 68th and 75th in an hour, you might see about 30 girls out there. Now you see 60 to 65 girls in an hour. What shifted? The answer, the anti-trafficking advocates told me, a Senate bill, Bill 357, signed by Governor Gavin Newsom in July. The measure decriminalized loitering with the intent to engage in prostitution. The bill did not officially take effect until January 1st of this year, 2023. But from the moment it became law back in July, these women say the on-the-ground reality changed. The minute the governor signed it, you started seeing an uptick in the streets, Powell said, and on social media. The pimps were saying, you better get out there and work because the streets are ours. The pimps were right. Police stopped making arrests for crimes that would no longer be charged. The anti-loitering statute had provided the grounds for officers to question women and children whom they suspected might be trapped in a prostitution ring. As a police officer, you need probable cause to stop and investigate, Powell explained. So if I have a law that says you can't loiter in the area with pasties and a G-string flagging down cars, I could stop you for that because you're loitering. But if I just say I'm stopping you because you look kind of young, that's a little weak. So it takes away a tool. Without the statute, police hands were suddenly tied. Henceforth, questioning the girls and potentially provoking a violent confrontation with pimps came to seem a Pyrrhic gamble, one that California's police officers would now avoid. Prostitution remains legal in California, but remains illegal in California. But police have lost significant ground in the effort to contain it. Women at anti-trafficking nonprofits in the Bay Area, San Diego, and Los Angeles all emphasized the only time they have the right to engage and investigate is if they hear the transaction going on between buyer and exploited person, said Russell, who works closely with Oakland Police Department, which means I would have to be a sting operation. It would have to be a sting operation where there's an undercover officer posing as an exploitative person who can actually hear the transaction. Any other scenario would not be grounds for the police to get involved. Sergeant Marosa Campos of the Oakland Police Department told me that his force rescued 24 underage girls from the streets in 2021. But in 2022, that number dropped to 14, and most from before the law was signed. Since I believe July, when we were officially told it passed, we have been directed by the DA's office to not arrest for statute 653.22, which is loitering, he said. You might wonder at this point who actually benefits from SB 357. Sergeant Campos wonders wonders too. Not the communities, he said, for whom a rise in trafficking brings more gun violence, which often attends the prostitution. Not the sex workers, many of whom rely on police officers to help in escaping their pimps. I think, if anything, it probably helps the sex traffickers the most, Campos said. Why would anyone propose such a law? Why would the California state legislature pass it? I asked the bill's author, San Francisco-based State Senator Scott Wiener. The answer he gave is the one that he supplies for so many of the bills that he authors. It was necessary to advance the rights of LGBTQ people. If you're standing on the sidewalk with high heels and you wear your hair a certain way and you wear tight clothing, an officer can say, I think you're loitering with the intent to commit prostitution, and arrest you. Wiener said, that is not how we should be doing things in the U.S. of America, arresting people for how they look. He continued, and when you do that, not surprisingly, it's only certain kinds of people who are actually getting arrested. It's trans women, it's black women. It's an inherently profiling law, he said. Randomly arresting a bunch of black trans women for how they look is not protecting potential victims of human trafficking. But were the police indeed randomly arresting a bunch of black trans women? The anti-trafficking advocates I spoke with dispute this. For starters, Wilson, Powell, and Russell, all of whom are African American, say that biological women and girls, not transgender individuals, constitute the vast majority of the trafficked. Nearly every report on human trafficking by global human rights organizations confirms that observation. And if the women I saw on Figueroa are any indication, discerning which are involved in prostitution does not require sophisticated sartorial judgments, but only 2 eyes and a brain. If a woman is wearing a G-string bikini in the middle of the street and she's flagging down cars while men in dark clothes stand watch as if holding an invisible leash, she is very likely to be a modern-day sex slave. Russell, who has worked in tech for 20 years, became interested in combating human trafficking while teaching inner-city kids to dance. 12 years ago, one of her students, age 15, was raped in Hayward and then trafficked throughout California for about a year. The girl had no mother or father in her life. She was being raised by family members, and someone did a strategy that's called Romeo pimping to get her to believe they were her boyfriend. And then they introduced violence into the relationship, Russell says. And she, the girl, ended up being sold by multiple exploiters throughout the Bay Area, in Vallejo, Southern California, and Oakland, and so on. Russell started Love Never Fails as part of a rescue mission for girls like her former student. 12 years ago, people didn't even know what human trafficking was. There were all these myths about it being something that's happening overseas. There were myths about slavery has ended here. And so I think we did a good job of demonstrating that, no, it's alive and well, and it's happening here in the U.S. 83% of all cases within the U.S. are of U.S.-born people. On my ride along with Powell and Wilson in L.A. just after 10 p.m., before the track really gets going, I saw several lines of vehicles stretching around the block, each manned by a prospective client waiting for his chance with one of the girls. At least 35 females worked the lines, most of them white or Latina. Many looked very young, under 18. I identified only one prostitute as transgender, though Powell noted there were likely others at a second location on Western Avenue. Powell and Wilson told me that the traffic starts to pick up at 11 and peaks at midnight. As the hour neared 11, more and more women indeed appeared along Figueroa, but Powell and Wilson made sure we left out before midnight. After 11:30, the chance of gun violence erupting around the pimps escalates. We wouldn't be safe. In Oakland and San Diego area, Russell and Maria Ugarte, a woman who runs an anti-trafficking group out of San Diego County, reiterated that the vast majority of the trafficked are female African-American women and girls in Oakland. Russell was careful to specify, but there's another population Russell has seen rise in the last few years among the ranks of victims, those that identify as LGBTQIA. Scott Wiener's social media antics might invite comparisons with those of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez or Ilhan Omar on Twitter. He has posted pictures of himself posing bare-chested in San Francisco's Folsom Street Fair, arms slung around men in bondage gear. During the monkeypox outbreak last summer, he approvingly tweeted in an article encouraging gay men to cover up their bumps with Band-Aids and party on, and he threatened to make Drag Queen 101 a mandatory part of K-12 education. He later said that threat was tongue-in-cheek. Like other media adroit, attention-seeking politician, Wiener seems to delight in trolling his detractors. Yet, in a political era defined by legislative gridlock in Washington, Wiener stands out as one of the nation's most effective lawmakers. In 6 years since the Harvard law grad took office, he managed to author and get passed a series of radical gender or sex-related bills. The measures have allowed biological male felons to self-ID their way into women's prisons, assigned criminal penalties to healthcare workers who failed to provide gender-affirming care, made California a sanctuary state for LGBTQ youth, expanded access to gender-affirming care for LGBTQ-identified youth with and without parental approval, proposed jail time for healthcare workers who willfully and repeatedly misgender a patient, that is, referred to them in a way at odds with their identity, gender identity, decriminalize the intentional exposure of a sexual partner to HIV, and reduce criminal penalties for sex offenders. Another Wiener bill introduced in 2021 sought to decriminalize psilocybin and ketamine, but it failed to pass partly because of the vocal opposition of former State Senate Republican Melissa Melendez, who rallied against easing of restrictions on ketamine, a drug notorious for facilitating date rape. I'm like, do you guys not see the agenda here? I mean, honestly, in the legislature, I think people came to just sort of accept those types of bills from him because he's from San Francisco, said Melissa in a telephone conversation. Undeterred, Wiener in December reintroduced a modified version of the bill. In thoroughly blue California, where Democratic lawmakers have since 2018 enjoyed a veto-proof supermajority in both chambers, Republican legislators are all but irrelevant, and Governor Newsom is a legislative show poodle. It's Wiener who calls the shots. Poodle Wiener. Republicans and centrist Democrats are often frustrated in trying to oppose bills coming from the left. As both a former Senate aide and a California Republican Party strategist told me, Wiener, one of the country's most prominent and outspoken defenders of LGBTQ rights, is uniquely difficult to oppose. The moment you speak out against one of his bills, just like he does with me, he turns around and says, "You're homophobic, transphobic, you're this, you're that." Melendez said, "I don't care. You can call me whatever name you want. That doesn't change the fact of what your bill does." Wiener, indeed, typically argues that his politically charged gender and sex-related bills are needed to fight invidious discrimination against LGBTQ people. When Greg Abbott announced that the state of Texas, the state of Texas was going to investigate and prosecute parents who had allowed their trans kids to get gender-affirming care, we knew we had to do something, he said. And then we saw it started to spread to other states. And so we sprang into action, and together, the Sanctuary State Bill was made to make clear that if kids did not feel safe in Texas or other states, they could come to California, and we would do our best to protect them. But if some of Wiener's bills seek to protect LGBTQ youth, they also represent a golden opportunity to a different group, the adults who would take advantage of them. Wiener is an extremely dangerous person. Extremely dangerous, so extremely dangerous that I cannot believe that people cannot read in between the lines, said Marissa Ugarte, who runs the anti-trafficking nonprofit Bilateral Safety Corridor Coalition based in National City, just south of San Diego. Wiener is turning California, she warned, into a sex trafficking paradise. Whatever the intent behind many of his bills, this does seem to be their effect, to make life better for sexual predators. Consider the Wiener authored SB 145, a 2020 measure that amended the sex offender registration laws in California so that an adult having anal or oral sex with a minor could avoid getting placed on sex offender registry as long as the child was at least 14 and the adult was no more than a decade older. Defenders of the law have noted that there has long been judicial latitude in California in whether to place perpetrators of statutory rape on sex offender registry if the crime involved was vaginal intercourse with a minor, and the minor was at least 14, and the offender within 10 years of her age. Wiener's bill extends such potential leniency in sentencing statutory rape of anal or oral sex. He has many times defended the bill as required to end blatant discrimination against LGBT young people regarding California's sex offender registry, his website declares. The only thing SB 145 did was to treat LGBTQ youth exactly the same way as straight youth have always been treated on the sex offender registry, which is, if you're within a certain age range and there's statutory rape, then judges have the discretion to decide whether someone should go on the registry, he told me. Wiener is correct on the history. California did treat 25-year-old statutory rapists differently depending on the manner of intercourse they had with their victim. The discrepancy called out for remediation. The same treatment should apply to anal sex with a minor. But the problem is inequality. If the problem is inequality, why not place both sets of offenders on the registry? Why not amend the registry so 24-year-old who has sex with a 14-year-old will land on the registry, irrespective of whether that was statutory rape or as in anal or vaginal? My job is not to get equality for my community so that these queer kids' lives are not being ruined because of discrimination, he replied. We're just ending discrimination. If someone else wants to go in and try to change the law for everyone, they're entitled to introduce that bill. No one has done that yet, and all we're asking for is equal treatment, and that is a fundamental fairness. And if it's not the gay kids' responsibility to come and change the registry for everyone in order to get equality. But who exactly are these queer kids and gay kids he's talking about? He can't be referring to the young gay teens who are the victims of felony statutory rape. Those minors aren't being discriminated against by law. They were being protected by the bright line insistence that they were sexually off limits to predatory adults. When he refers to discrimination against queer kids, Wiener seems actually to be concerned with the law's unfairness to the perpetrators of felony statutory rape. That is, he worries about the 20-something adult, a kid in his turn of phrase, who has sex with a minor. many of us would reasonably oppose the persecution of, say, an 18-year-old high school senior arrested with consensual sex with a 16-year-old boyfriend or girlfriend. But in California, that scenario doesn't describe a felony and would not land somebody on the registry. Then why aren't we asking this of any other legislature? He replied. Okay. Sorry, skip something. But in California, that scenario doesn't describe a felony and does not require anyone to register as a sex offender. Wiener's bill deals with older offenders who have sexual relations with 14 or 15-year-olds. I asked him why those young teens shouldn't deserve the protection of the law. Then why aren't you asking this of any other legislator? He replied. I mean, honestly, what you're doing is you're saying to the gay people who are just asking to be treated equally, why don't you change everything for everyone? And no one's asking that of any straight legislator. Wow, now he's the victim. The equality argument in Wiener's classic sleight of hand, and he's practiced it many times. When he authored the bill to eliminate felony penalty enhancement for knowingly exposing a sexual partner to HIV, for example, he claimed the mantle of fighting the discrimination against those living with the disease. But as a consequence of the bill, there is now no justice for a gay man infected with HIV by a sex partner who lied about it. The violation of his consent and bodily integrity now go unvindicated. Similarly, the violent reality of today's pimp-dominated sex trade seems to have escaped Wiener's legislative pen. As we have seen, the repeal of his anti-loitering statute is a boon to human traffickers, not their victims. Has Wiener ever been down on Fig? Powell said, referring to the sex trade on Figueroa. Has he seen it? I really wonder. Nowhere in the disconnect between Wiener's talk of LGBTQ civil rights and the on-the-ground effects of his bills is more obvious than with his sanctuary state legislation, SB 107. Enacted in January 2023, the law purported to turn California into a state of refuge for trans kids and their families, as Wiener declared on Twitter. To understand the impact of this law, one should begin with the bill that it amends California's Uniform Child Custody Jurisdiction and Enforcement Act, UCCJEA, which deters interstate forum shopping and parental kidnapping by making jurisdiction in custody disputes the exclusive province of the home state courts. 49 of 50 states, including California, adopted this rule, voluntarily limiting the jurisdiction of their courts. For example, a father under investigation in Wisconsin's Child Protective Services cannot simply flee with his kid to Michigan to have his custody determination adjudicated in a jurisdiction he considers more favorable. But Wiener's sanctuary state bill now amends California UCCJEA to allow California courts to exercise jurisdiction where the parents would otherwise be prosecuted in their home states for having medically transitioned their minor children, a reaction to the laws in various states that have criminalized gender medical treatments to minors. The bill halts the extraction of such parents for these home state offenses and refuses to cooperate with out-of-state law enforcement for this purpose. The provision may simply be unconstitutional. California courts' refusal to cooperate with out-of-state subpoenas and extradition orders in this context may violate the full faith and credit clause of the U.S. Constitution. Look it up. Under which states are bound to enforce other states' court orders. But there is another arguably more mischievous provision of the sanctuary bill. It states, "A court of this state has temporary emergency jurisdiction if the child is present in the state and the child has been abandoned or it is necessary in an emergency to protect the child because the child or a sibling or a parent of the child is subjected to or threatened with mistreatment or abuse, or because the child has been unable to obtain gender-affirming health care or gender-affirming mental health care." Read that carefully. A court may obtain temporary emergency jurisdiction over the care of a child if she has been unable to obtain gender-affirming medical care in her home state. The law seems to equate child abuse and neglect with failing to provide gender-affirming medical transition procedures to a child. At the very least, the law treats them as equivalent for the purposes of letting the court take jurisdiction over the care of the minor. Does this bill promise that what it plainly seems to? Invite runaways to California from across the country to undergo gender medical transition? Does it permit California minors to liberate themselves from their families by coming before a judge declaring that they have been blocked from obtaining gender-affirming care by unsupportive parents and to so escape their parents' authority? I asked a criminal law expert with experience working on federal, state, joint criminal investigations to interpret this provision for me. Quote, "That means the kid is going to come to California, go to some state nonprofit, which will bring the kid before the family court, and the court would say, 'We find you've been abandoned and you've been unable to get necessary health care, and so we're going to assume custody over you and let you do that,'" she said. It's a heck of a carrot to dangle in front of a teenager already fighting with a parent, desperate to set limits. Come to California, where we have the power to liberate you from possibly the only adults in your life devoted to your best interest, the only reliable source of guardrails, or of the unfashionable but sometimes necessary to protect them. No. LGBTQ youth who arrive in California as a result of the bill and join the ranks of the homeless would be vulnerable to traffickers. If you build a sanctuary state, those seeking refuge will come, even if the refuge they seek is only from the parents' rules. Homeless youth have been flocking to California. Wiener has helped make the state a magnet for many more. In 2019, Wiener co-sponsored the LGBTQ Foster Youth Bill of Rights, another law with disturbing implications. The bill granted LGBTQ identified foster kids the rights, among other things, to abortions, contraceptions, medical treatment for sexual assault without the knowledge or consent of any adult. Included in this bill of new rights was the right to access computer technology and the internet. Suddenly, foster parents found it impossible to police internet access. The bill's supporters claim that internet access allows LGBTQ foster youth to obtain peer support. Such support is necessary, they say, since so many kids are extremely vulnerable, lacking intact family, and that same vulnerability should make us extraordinarily wary of government handing numberless adults what amounts to the right of the internet access to these children. After all, so much harm comes to adolescents via fiber optic cables. Why prevent foster parents, adults who the state has vetted, from regulating foster kids' communications with unvetted adults? As a result of this law, adult sexual predators of all orientations in California gain greater access to child victims. Internet has become a major tool for traffickers, particularly of boys, Ugarte told me. Sextortion is the new trend. When there's an avatar girl and they befriend a boy, then send them to a chat room and say, hey, I like you. Let me see your body. I want to see what you look like because you're so handsome. He gets naked, and then once they do that, they go and tell him, if you don't give us $5,000, we're going to expose you to the internet, meaning in every single social media. Wieners, detractors often assign him malign intentions, but guessing at an intent is unproductive. The truth is, his intent doesn't really matter. The effects of naivety, ambition, or wrong-headed zeal for social transformation can be just as devastating as anything proceeding from darker motives. I mean, he's a smart guy, a Republican former Senate staffer said. And on other issues, those that aren't hot-button social issues, he likes to hear opposing opinions and likes to try and address concerns people have. He's even earned the reputation in San Francisco for being a moderate, supportive of real estate developers who have donated handsomely, for instance, and opposing far leftists on the environment. Wiener is often statesmanlike and easy to get along with, the GOP staffer told me, and he would present a formidable candidate to replace Nancy Pelosi in the 11th District as her congressional career draws to a close. But in terms of legislative influence, that would almost be a step down for Wiener. From his perch in America's most left-leaning district, Wiener is already legislating for the country, establishing a mode for ambitious progressive office holders to follow and inviting America's misunderstood children to flock to the Golden State. The sex industry has historically capitalized on people who feel lost, people who feel unloved, people who feel unseen, Russell observed. And, they do a great job, especially when they're in the throes of it, of making that person believe they're having a good time. And then later, when they're more stabilized, they come back and go, oh my gosh, that was horrible. It was one of the worst times of my life. Editor's note. This story will appear in City Journal's upcoming special issue on California, which will be published in March 2023 and is reprinted here on Substack with permission from City Journal. Well, thank you for your attention today. I hope that article reading was helpful to you. Please comment, perhaps subscribe, but I would really like to know if this helped you. It was an over 30-minute read, and I want to thank you for coming to Not In Your Head Lesbian and invite you back. Let me know what you want to talk about. Just a few quick words about what I've gotten from that article. Is a truly detailed understanding of what and how sanctuary states work. The fact that it goes against the common practice of honoring other states, well, that de facto makes California's ruling on gender care for children a nationwide influence, and that is exceeding states' rights. That's the first thing. And the second thing, of course, is this whole notion of throwing so many women under the bus for the sake or for the lip service sake of a few supposedly black trans identified men. Thank you for your visit. Enjoy your day.